One of the things about Jude that is so amazing to me is the way that he calls upon the book of Enoch.
Yes.
And, of course, Enoch is in the early genealogy back in Genesis, and he talks about the angels that came down and corrupted humanity before the flood, and he uses them, I think, sort of as an example of what happened before.
Yes.
And now it's happening over again.
Yes.
But we wouldn't have made that connection had it not been for Jude.
Yeah, Jude draws upon, when you get past verse 4 that we just kind of talked about, the Lord goes into 6 examples of apostates. And he has 3 corporate examples and then 3 individual examples. And he covers the 3 corporate examples are Israel in the wilderness, the angels that sinned, and then Sodom and Gomorrah. And what's amazing, the order in which the Lord lists these in Jude is not the order in which they occurred in the Bible, in the Old Testament, but it lays out a pattern, which is why the Lord listed it this way. The children of Israel, they didn't listen to God in the wilderness, and so their faith was never built upon the Word of God. Remember when the Lord came down on Mount Sinai, and he wanted to speak to the entire congregation of Israel, all 2+ million of them.
Yeah.
And they were terrified because of the standard and the word of God. And so they all went to Moses. Remember, and they said, "Hey, Moses, from now on, you go talk to God and tell us what he says. We don't want to hear from him directly." And from that point on, Gary, it was abysmal failure for the children of Israel because they wanted someone else to tell them what God says instead of just picking up the word themselves and following it. And so through that, they started to become disobedient, which led to the second corporate group of apostates the Lord uses, which are the angels in verse 6, which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation. Now, these angels that rebelled, they didn't keep, there's only 2 places that God uses this Greek word. They're okaterion. They left their first estate, but left their own okaterion, their habitation. They disrobed themselves of the glory that's reserved for you and I in our resurrected bodies. It's the same word. When we get our resurrected body, we look to our okaterion. And that's amazing, the house upon that God's going to clothe us with. And then you get to Sodom and Gomorrah, so these angels that rebelled, and then it ultimately led to destruction as Sodom and Gomorrah. You know, there's a lot of examples out of Sodom and Gomorrah, Gary, that are so applicable to us today. Here you have Lot, who the New Testament says was a righteous soul. And when you go read the story, it doesn't seem like he was a very righteous man. I mean, he tried to give his daughters over to the people in Sodom. Lot sat in the city gate of Sodom. He was likely a high-up city official in Sodom. When you study that process of even how he ended up there, he broke fellowship with Abraham. He didn't go where he was supposed to with them. He wanted to live in the world, so to speak.
Now, the odd thing that comes out, I think, in this book, or maybe we should call it the unique thing that comes out, is the way that he weaves the concept of sensuality into the concept of the gospel and or opposition to the gospel. And, you know, it's shocking. And I remember the first time I ever heard this years ago about the angels who left their first estate, the angels who came down and took earth women as their own wives and totally rebelled against everything that God had ordained up to that point. And I'm thinking to myself, why? Why would they do that? Because they were in a perfect position. They were in a position to be close to the Creator. And they lived, from what we know, wonderful lives of power and enjoyment and, you know, maybe relaxation. We don't really know how they lived, but they threw all that away to rebel.
Yeah.
And that theme runs entirely through the Bible. not necessarily with angels, but later on with human beings and leaders of men, emperors, and that whole theme of abandoning your own power structure and leaping on God's power structure and trying to corrupt it for your own uses is really one of the central themes in the whole Bible.
That's right. It's the draw of the world, right? It's the temptation. It's the same temptation that Satan gave Jesus in the wilderness.
Absolutely.
And he showed him all the kingdoms of the earth and promised the Lord, I'll give these to you if you just bow to me. In other words, don't go to the cross. I'll just give this to you. And which was a temptation to Jesus. But Jesus, using the word of God, combated the evil one, the enemy, the Satan himself. And when you get down, Gary, we talked about the three corporate groups of apostates. Then you get into, right after those corporate groups, you get into the way that we are to war. When Michael, the archangel in verse 9, contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses. And he didn't bring against him a railing accusation, but said, the Lord rebuke thee. And what's amazing about that is that when you are doing spiritual warfare with the enemy, you don't have to bring about an accusation. You just have to use the word of God. The Lord rebuke you. And I love that promise.